Some promises do not end when a uniform comes off. They simply wait for the right season to be kept. Long before sunrise reached the northern mountains, a single light glowed inside a weathered log cabin overlooking a remote glacial lake in northern British Columbia, less than 50 kilometers from the Yukon border. Jack Sullivan had followed the same morning ritual for years. The kettle whistled softly. Fresh coffee filled an old steel thermos that had traveled beside him through countless search operations. His faded hiking boots waited beside the front door, cleaned the night before out of habit rather than necessity. Retirement had slowed many things, but it had never changed the way he prepared for a day outdoors. On the wall above a wooden shelf hung a framed photograph taken more than 3 decades earlier. A younger Jack stood shoulder to shoulder with several Royal Canadian Mounted Police search officers beside a helicopter dusted with spring snow. Their smiles belonged to people who still believed every search ended with an answer. Jack paused for only a moment before taking the frame down. He wiped a thin layer of dust from the glass with his sleeve, studying the faces without speaking. Tucked into the corner of the frame was an old newspaper clipping. Most of the print had faded, leaving only a headline still readable. Regional aircraft missing during spring flight. Jack quietly slid the clipping back into place, returned the photograph to the shelf, and closed the cabinet door. Some memories belonged exactly where they had been left. Behind him, Rex slowly rose from his blanket near the fireplace. Age had painted the old German shepherd's muzzle almost completely white. His movements were slower now, careful rather than weak. 12 years earlier, he could leap into the truck before Jack even reached the driver's door. Today, Jack rested one hand beneath the old dog's chest, giving him the extra support he never used to need. Rex looked up with calm brown eyes that had searched forests, mountains, frozen rivers, and forgotten trails beside Jack for nearly a decade. They no longer needed commands to understand each other. One last spring patrol. Partner, Jack said with a gentle smile. Just like every other year. Since retiring from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police dog service 3 years earlier, Jack had kept one tradition alive. Every spring, after the ice released its grip on the northern lakes, he and Rex walked several of the old search routes they had once covered in uniform. Officially, they were simply enjoying retirement. In truth, Jack believed old trails deserved to be remembered. Northern landscapes changed every year. Melting snow uncovered abandoned camps, broken canoes, forgotten equipment, and sometimes traces of stories that nature had hidden beneath another long winter. Most years they found nothing at all, and Jack considered that a good thing. The truck rolled north beneath towering spruce forests as pale sunlight slowly spilled across distant peaks still wrapped in snow. Ravens drifted above the highway. Somewhere beyond the trees, the lonely call of a loon echoed across unseen water. The sound had never changed, no matter how many years passed. Nearly an hour later, they turned onto an abandoned forestry road that ended beside the lake. Jack stepped out first, breathing deeply as crisp northern air carried the scent of wet earth and melting ice. The shoreline looked unfamiliar. Winter had released the lake earlier than usual, leaving the water noticeably lower than any spring Jack could remember. Fresh gravel bars stretched into open water. New patches of pale sand gleamed beneath the morning light where waves had never reached before. Looks different this year, Jack murmured. Rex climbed down from the truck and followed without hurry. There was no eager sprint anymore, only quiet purpose. They walked side by side for nearly half a kilometer, leaving the first footprints across untouched sand. Jack stopped occasionally to admire the changing shoreline, while Rex moved with his nose close to the ground, reading scents too old and too faint for any human to notice. Then, without warning, the leash tightened. Jack took another step before realizing Rex had stopped completely. The old shepherd stood motionless beside a narrow sandbar newly exposed by the retreating water. His ears leaned forward. His breathing slowed. Every muscle in his body became perfectly still. "Come on, partner," Jack said gently. Rex did not move. Jack smiled at first, assuming tired legs had finally caught up with his oldest friend. He gave the leash a light pull. Nothing. Another gentle tug. Still nothing. For the first time since they had become partners, Rex quietly refused a command. Jack looked around the empty shoreline. There was nothing unusual. No footprints. No fishing gear. No wildlife. Only wind brushing across pale sand and gentle waves folding onto the shore. He switched off the truck keys. He had absent-mindedly begun spinning around one finger and simply watched the old dog. Rex never looked at him. His eyes remained fixed on the ground beneath his paws. Jack felt a strange uneasiness settle into the silence. He finally released the tension on the leash. 5 more minutes, he whispered. Then we head home. Rex still did not move. Somewhere far across the lake, the deep crack of shifting spring ice echoed through the mountains like a heavy door slowly closing. For reasons Jack could not explain, it sounded less like an ending than the beginning of something waiting to be found. Jack never intended to use the extra 5 minutes he had promised. He expected Rex to lose interest, sniff the breeze one last time, and quietly follow him back toward the truck. That was how retirement usually worked. Old habits appeared for a moment before fading away again. Instead, the old German shepherd remained exactly where he was. The wind shifted gently across the sandbar, carrying the clean scent of melting snow and glacial water. Rex lowered his head until his nose hovered only a few centimeters above the ground. Then he began moving, not forward, but in slow, overlapping circles no wider than 3 meters. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen that pattern countless times during missing person investigations. Search dogs rarely walked in straight lines after locating an important scent cone. They narrowed it, patiently reducing uncertainty until instinct became certainty. Jack quietly unclipped the leash. Rex did not run. He continued, working with calm precision, stopping every few steps before changing direction again. There was no excitement in his movements. No barking, no scratching, only disciplined concentration. "All right," Jack whispered. "Show me what you were trying to say." Nearly 20 minutes passed. The only sounds were distant waves and the occasional cry of a raven somewhere beyond the spruce trees. Finally, Rex stopped beside a patch of damp sand no different from anything surrounding it. He stood perfectly still before slowly lowering his body until his front paws rested against the ground. Jack's expression changed immediately. During his years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Rex had been trained to give exactly that passive indication whenever disturbing the location might damage important evidence. It was a behavior Jack had not witnessed since their final operational deployment. He looked carefully around the area before stepping closer. Nothing appeared unusual. No exposed routes. No discarded camping equipment. No signs that anyone had visited recently. Kneeling carefully, Jack picked up a weathered hiking stick lying nearby and pressed its tip gently into the sand. The stick slid easily through the soft upper layer before stopping with a faint metallic tap. Jack froze. He withdrew the stick and tried again approximately 20 centimeters away. The same quiet sound answered him. Not stone, not wood, metal. He remained motionless for several long seconds. Curiosity urged him to dig deeper. Experience told him not to. Instead, he removed a small folding knife from his pocket and used only the flat spine of the blade to brush away the thinnest layer of damp sand covering the surface. Within moments, a narrow strip of dull silver emerged beneath the grains. It reflected almost no light, softened by decades beneath water and sediment. Jack brushed away only enough to reveal several centimeters before immediately stopping. Even without exposing more, he noticed something unusual. The metal curved gently rather than lying flat. More importantly, a perfectly straight row of evenly spaced rivets crossed its surface. He quietly exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. Northern lakes often reveal forgotten machinery after spring runoff, but this did not resemble old logging equipment or an abandoned dock. The workmanship felt too precise, too deliberate. Jack reached into his backpack and removed the small handheld global positioning system receiver he always carried on wilderness hikes. He marked the coordinates, then took several photographs from different angles without touching the object again. After documenting everything, he carefully pushed the loose sand back into place until the exposed metal disappeared beneath the shoreline exactly as he had found it. Rex finally stood, but instead of looking toward the truck, he stared farther north along the water's edge. His work here was not finished. As they drove home beneath a sky turning pale with evening light, Jack remained unusually quiet. Back inside the cabin, he transferred the photographs onto his old laptop and enlarged the clearest image. His pulse slowed the moment the rivets filled the screen. Near one edge, barely visible beneath years of weathering, a fragment of faded lettering emerged from the aluminum. Only 3 incomplete characters remained. C-A-N. Jack leaned closer, the color draining from his face. No, he whispered to himself. It cannot be. Outside, Rex lay awake on the porch instead of coming inside, his eyes fixed toward the distant lake as darkness settled over the northern valley. Jack barely noticed the sun rising the next morning. His coffee had gone cold hours earlier, while the enlarged photograph remained frozen across the laptop screen. 3 weathered letters. C-A-N. They might have meant nothing at all. Countless manufacturers stamped partial markings onto aircraft panels, and decades beneath water could distort almost any inscription. Yet something about those faded characters refused to leave him alone. He closed the laptop, walked upstairs, and unlocked a narrow cedar cabinet he had not opened in years. Inside were the notebooks he had carried throughout his career with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Every search assignment, every map, every weather report, every lesson learned. Jack selected the oldest volume, its dark cover softened by time, and carried it back downstairs. Rex remained quietly on the porch, watching the northern horizon instead of following him inside. Jack flipped slowly through fading pages filled with careful handwriting until one loose photograph slipped free and drifted onto the wooden floor. He picked it up. The image showed a much younger version of himself standing beside a Royal Canadian Mounted Police helicopter parked on a frozen shoreline. Behind the aircraft, a temporary operations sign stood in the snow. Most of the lettering had disappeared with age, but 2 words remained visible. Aircraft search. Jack stared at the photograph for several long seconds before turning it over. A handwritten date covered the back. April, 34 years earlier. He remembered the operation immediately. Days of flying over endless forests. Long lines of volunteers walking frozen shorelines. Bitter winds that erased footprints within minutes. They had searched until there was nowhere left to search. Or at least that was what everyone had believed. Jack closed the notebook and rested both hands on the table. Not again, he whispered. It cannot be the same one. By late morning, he drove into the nearest town, carrying only the printed photographs. Rather than calling anyone officially, he stopped at a small aviation maintenance workshop where an old friend named Graham Bennett still repaired bush planes despite officially retiring several years before. Graham adjusted his glasses while studying the photographs beneath a bright inspection lamp. He remained silent for almost a full minute. Then he reached into a drawer and removed a sheet of rivet spacing diagrams used during aircraft inspections. One by one, he compared the measurements visible in Jack's photographs against the reference chart. Finally, he looked up. "This is not marine aluminum," he said quietly. "It is aircraft skin." Jack said nothing. Graham continued examining the enlarged image until his finger stopped beside the faded lettering. "These letters probably are not part of the registration," he explained. "More likely they belong to a manufacturing stencil. You cannot identify an aircraft from this alone." Jack felt a brief sense of relief. Perhaps he had imagined the connection after all. Then Graham leaned back in his chair. "But I can tell you something else." He pointed toward the gentle curvature running across the exposed panel. Whatever this came from was not a small fragment. It belonged to something much larger. The workshop fell silent. Outside, a float plane taxied slowly across the nearby river before lifting into the clear northern sky. Jack watched it disappear between distant mountains. His thoughts drifted back to the newly exposed sandbar and to the old shepherd who had refused to leave it. Graham folded the photographs carefully and handed them back. "If you go again," he said, "do not go looking for answers. Go looking for the rest of the story." Jack drove home without turning on the radio. Rex was already waiting beside the truck before the engine stopped. The old shepherd did not greet him with the usual wag of his tail. Instead, he walked directly to the passenger door and waited, as though he had known all along that they would be returning to the lake. Late that afternoon, beneath gathering clouds and a colder wind sweeping across the valley, Jack parked beside the deserted shoreline for the third time. He expected Rex to stop at the buried aluminum. Instead, the old shepherd walked straight past it without slowing down. Jack watched him disappear farther along the water's edge until, nearly 50 meters away, Rex suddenly froze beside another patch of dark shoreline. This time, whatever had called him, there was no metal at all. The wind had strengthened by the time Jack caught up with Rex. Low clouds drifted across the mountains, casting long shadows over the shoreline as gentle waves washed against the newly exposed sand. The buried aluminum lay behind them now, almost forgotten. Whatever had first captured Rex's attention no longer seemed important to him. The old shepherd stood motionless beside a narrow strip of dark sediment where reeds bent quietly in the breeze. Jack stopped several meters away. He knew better than to interrupt. Search dogs often reached a point where instinct became more reliable than any command. Rex lowered his nose one final time before slowly easing himself onto the ground. Not with exhaustion, with purpose. His front paws rested neatly together. His eyes never left the patch of earth directly ahead. Jack felt a familiar chill settle across his shoulders. During active service, that silent indication had always carried a special meaning. Rex had been trained never to scratch or disturb locations where fragile evidence might exist. Instead, he would lie down and wait for his handler to understand. Jack removed his cap and stood quietly for several seconds, allowing memory to guide him instead of curiosity. He approached carefully, placing each step outside the area where Rex had indicated. Kneeling beside the damp shoreline, he studied the ground before reaching for anything. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Small stones, flattened reeds from the previous autumn, fine layers of dark sediment deposited by years of spring runoff. He reached into his backpack and removed a small hand trowel rather than a larger folding shovel. Every movement became slow and deliberate. He lifted only the thinnest layer of loose soil, no deeper than necessary to understand what Rex had found. The smell of cold earth rose gently into the air, carrying the scent of ground that sunlight had not touched in decades. After several careful minutes, the edge of something dark emerged beneath the sediment. Jack brushed away a little more soil, using only his gloved fingertips. The outline gradually appeared. An old leather hiking boot rested quietly beneath the shoreline, its shape preserved by years of cold water and fine silt. Time had darkened the leather almost black, yet its stitching remained surprisingly visible. Jack stopped immediately. He did not touch again. Instead, he slowly leaned back, allowing years of professional discipline to take control. Whatever story this shoreline held had suddenly become far more complicated than abandoned aircraft debris. He quietly reached into his pack and removed a bright orange survey flag, placing it several meters away rather than beside the boot to avoid disturbing the immediate area. Then he stepped backward, studying both discovery sites together. Nearly 50 meters separated the buried aluminum from the old boot. They did not belong to two unrelated stories. Jack could feel it. Somewhere between those two locations lay a truth that had remained hidden longer than anyone intended. Rex finally lifted his head and looked toward Jack. Their eyes met for only a moment. Jack did not see excitement in the old shepherd's expression. He saw certainty, the kind that years of training could never fully explain. Jack slowly reached into his jacket and removed the satellite phone he carried whenever he traveled beyond reliable cell coverage. His thumb paused over several names before stopping on one he had not called in almost 3 years. Sergeant Daniel Mackenzie. Former search coordinator. Former partner. Jack pressed the call button and listened as the signal searched across the northern sky. Daniel answered after only 2 rings. Jack, there was surprise in his voice. Everything all right? Jack looked once more toward Rex before answering. I need you to come to the lake, he said quietly. Do not bring a shovel. A long silence followed. Daniel knew Jack well enough to hear what had not been said. Did you find something? Jack removed his cap and stared across the water where the evening light reflected like polished steel beneath the gathering clouds. I think, he replied carefully, my dog just found someone who never made it home. The line remained silent for several seconds before Daniel finally spoke. His voice had changed completely. Do not touch anything, he said, especially not the boot. Stay exactly where you are. I am leaving now. Jack and Rex remained exactly where they were until the last light faded behind the mountains. Neither man nor dog crossed the marked area again. The old shepherd lay quietly beside the orange survey flag, never once attempting to return to the boot. It was as though he understood that the search now belonged to someone else. Nearly 2 hours later, headlights appeared between the spruce trees. A single sport utility vehicle rolled slowly down the abandoned forestry road before stopping well away from the shoreline. Daniel Mackenzie stepped out carrying only a flashlight, a field notebook, and a small evidence camera. He wore plain outdoor clothing beneath a Royal Canadian Mounted Police field jacket. Retirement had added gray to Jack's beard. Active service had added caution to Daniel's eyes. They shook hands without speaking. Some partnerships never needed unnecessary words. Jack led him first to the partially buried aluminum panel. Daniel crouched several meters away, studying the exposed edge without crossing the disturbed ground. Did you uncover any more after taking the photographs? He asked. No, Jack answered. Only enough to confirm it was metal. Then I covered it exactly as I found it. Daniel nodded once. Good. They walked together toward the second location. When Daniel saw the weathered boot still resting beneath the thin layer of exposed soil, he quietly removed his cap. He did not step closer. He simply stood in silence, allowing years of investigative experience to absorb the scene before reaching for his camera. After documenting both locations from a safe distance, he lowered the camera and looked directly at Jack. You did everything right, he said. If you had dug another 20 centimeters, we might have lost information that can never be replaced. Jack exhaled slowly. He had not realized how much he needed to hear those words. Daniel walked a short distance away before making several official calls over his satellite phone. The first was to the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police detachment. The second went to the British Columbia Coroner Service. He deliberately stopped there. Jack noticed. What about the Transportation Safety Board? He asked quietly. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket. Not yet, he replied. Right now we have 2 discoveries. We do not have a confirmed aircraft site. We'll let the evidence decide what comes next. Jack smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like the investigator Daniel had always been. The following morning, shortly after sunrise, 2 Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigators arrived together with members of the coroner service. The shoreline was photographed before anyone entered it. Bright survey tape outlined a controlled perimeter extending well beyond both discovery sites. Every footprint inside the boundary was recorded. Every movement was deliberate. Jack remained outside the tape beside Rex, watching the investigation unfold exactly as he had watched hundreds of scenes during his own career. This time he was no longer the investigator. He was the witness who knew when to remain silent. Throughout the morning, forensic specialists exposed only enough of the aluminum to document its shape. The curved surface continued far beneath the sand, much farther than anyone expected. One investigator quietly measured the visible section before exchanging a thoughtful glance with another. No conclusions were spoken aloud. Shortly after midday, the lead investigator approached Daniel, carrying several photographs taken beneath the exposed edge. Daniel studied them for a long moment before turning toward Jack. I think it is time, he said. Jack understood immediately. Daniel picked up his satellite phone once more. This time he contacted the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. He did not report a recovered aircraft. He reported something far more careful. "We have evidence suggesting a possible buried aviation site," he said. "At this stage, we require technical assessment." 2 mornings later, after specialist equipment had traveled north from Prince George, a ground-penetrating radar team slowly began surveying the shoreline. The monitor displayed scattered underground reflections at first. Then long, continuous shapes emerged beneath the sand, extending far beyond the single aluminum panel. The technician stopped pushing the radar cart and stared silently at the screen. Daniel stepped beside him. "What are you seeing?" he asked. The technician swallowed before answering. "I cannot identify it yet," he said quietly. "But whatever is buried beneath this shoreline, it is not just one piece of metal. It is an entire debris field." 2 days passed before the first technical assessment was complete. During that time, the shoreline remained sealed behind bright survey tape, while specialists worked methodically beneath gray northern skies. Nobody hurried the excavation. Every layer of sand was photographed before it was removed. Every measurement was checked twice. Jack visited each morning with a fresh thermos of coffee, yet he never crossed the perimeter. Years in uniform had taught him that respecting a scene also meant respecting the people whose lives might still be connected to it. Rex rested beside him beneath a stand of spruce trees overlooking the lake. The old shepherd rarely slept deeply anymore. Every so often he lifted his head, watching the investigators with quiet attention before settling back onto his blanket. Daniel joined Jack near the edge of the shoreline shortly after sunrise on the third day. Neither man spoke for several minutes. They simply watched the excavation continue. Finally, one of the Transportation Safety Board engineers waved them closer to a viewing area outside the controlled zone. The curved aluminum section first discovered by Jack had now been exposed far enough to reveal its true proportions. It was no random sheet of metal. The taper, the reinforcing ribs beneath the surface, and the pattern of rivets left little room for doubt. "It is part of a wing," the engineer said calmly. "We still cannot identify the aircraft, but we are no longer asking what it is. We are asking which one." Jack looked toward the open water without answering. The words settled heavily inside him. Throughout the afternoon, additional survey grids were completed using ground-penetrating radar. The technician carefully overlaid each scan onto a digital map until separate reflections began forming one continuous pattern beneath the shoreline. Long structural sections, smaller fragments scattered farther north, dense anomalies buried deeper beneath layers of glacial sediment. A geologist standing nearby quietly explained what decades of spring runoff had done. Every year, snowmelt carried fresh sand into the lake. Winter ice compressed those deposits before another season added more. Over 30 years, the shoreline itself had slowly migrated outward, burying everything beneath it. "The landscape has been rewriting its own map," he said, "until this spring. An unusually dry winter followed by. Rapid snowmelt had lowered the lake enough to uncover the tip of the buried wing. Had the water remained slightly higher, nothing would have been visible. Nature had revealed the site during a remarkably narrow moment." Late that afternoon, another message arrived from the Transportation Safety Board headquarters after specialists compared construction details, rivet spacing, and surviving manufacturing marks with archived records. Daniel read the report once before handing it silently to Jack. The partial markings matched a regional twin-engine passenger aircraft model commonly operated across northern British Columbia more than 3 decades earlier. It was not enough to identify one specific aircraft, but it reduced the possibilities to only a handful of historical flights. Jack felt a memory stirring that refused to stay buried. Without speaking, he returned to his truck and retrieved the weathered notebook he had carried since the beginning of his career. Sitting alone on a fallen log overlooking the lake, he turned slowly through yellowed pages until he reached entries dated 34 years earlier. Daily weather reports, search sectors, aircraft assignments, volunteer teams, and his eyes stopped on one page. Across the top he had written, in younger handwriting that now seemed almost unfamiliar, regional passenger aircraft search. Beneath it were 18 consecutive days of coordinates stretching across rivers, valleys, frozen lakes, and mountain ridges. The final entry was painfully brief. Day 18. Search suspended due to deteriorating conditions. Jack stared at the page without blinking. At the bottom rested a single signature written in blue ink. Jack Sullivan. He slowly closed the notebook and held it against his chest as the cold wind drifted across the lake. For more than 3 decades, he had believed that search had ended because there was nothing left to find. Now, standing only a few hundred meters from the forgotten shoreline they had never searched, he realized the truth was far more difficult to accept. They had not failed because they stopped looking. They had simply stopped in the wrong place. The notebook remained on Jack's kitchen table that night, still open to the page he had not looked at in more than 3 decades. He read the final entry again before quietly closing the cover. The words had not changed, but their meaning had. For years he had believed that the search team had done everything possible. Now he knew they had simply been defeated by a landscape that had refused to surrender its secret. Early the next morning, he returned to the shoreline before most of the investigation team arrived. Thin mist floated above the lake, softening the outlines of the surrounding mountains. Rex stepped out of the truck more slowly than usual, but the moment his paws touched the damp ground, his attention returned to the northern shoreline. Jack noticed it immediately. The old shepherd was not interested in the exposed wing where engineers continued documenting structural details. Instead, he kept watching the stretch of shoreline beyond the main excavation. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, carrying updated survey maps. Before discussing the latest findings, he noticed Rex staring into the distance. "He is looking somewhere else," Daniel said. Jack nodded. "He's been doing that since the first day." Daniel spoke briefly with the lead forensic investigator. After confirming that the untouched area had already been photographed and documented, permission was given for one carefully supervised search beyond the active excavation grid. Jack unclipped the leash. "Go ahead, partner," he said quietly. Rex moved at a slow, measured pace. Age had taken away his speed, but never his discipline. He traveled north along the shoreline, pausing every few meters to test the breeze before continuing. Several investigators stopped working to watch. Nobody spoke. Nearly 70 meters beyond the exposed wing, Rex suddenly stopped beside a narrow strip of reeds where dark sediment met the water. He lowered himself into the same calm indication Jack had seen only once before. The forensic team carefully marked the location before beginning a controlled examination using small wooden tools and soft brushes. Within minutes, the corner of a weathered leather wallet emerged from beneath the compacted soil. It remained closed, protected by the cold conditions that had preserved it beneath layers of sediment for decades. The item was photographed exactly where it rested before being carefully secured for examination elsewhere. One investigator looked toward Jack with quiet surprise. "Your dog never once indicated the wing," she said. "He came here." Jack watched Rex without taking his eyes off the old shepherd. "He was never searching for an aircraft," he answered softly. "He was searching for someone." Encouraged by the discovery, investigators expanded the survey beyond the original excavation area. Guided by geological mapping and the natural movement of shoreline sediment, several additional locations were examined over the next 2 days. Each new search was based on evidence rather than assumption, yet each one brought investigators closer to understanding what had happened after the aircraft entered the lake. The hydrologist explained that powerful spring currents, combined with shifting ice over many years, could gradually separate personal belongings from the main wreckage before burying them beneath new layers of sand. Nothing had been deliberately hidden. Nature had simply rearranged everything one season at a time. By the 3rd afternoon, Transportation Safety Board specialists and investigators from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police met beside the temporary command trailer. Historical flight records, construction details, recovered materials, and Jack's old search notes all pointed toward the same conclusion. Daniel walked quietly toward Jack, carrying a thin archival folder. "We finally know which investigation this belongs to," he said. Jack did not open the folder immediately. Somehow he already knew. Daniel rested one hand gently on his shoulder. "You were here 34 years ago," he said. "You just did not know the lake was keeping the answers from you." Jack lowered his eyes without speaking. Before he could respond, a young forensic investigator approached, glancing first at Rex and then at Jack. "May I ask you something?" she said. Jack nodded. She looked at the old German shepherd resting peacefully beside the shoreline. How did he know where to search after all this time? Jack followed her gaze toward his oldest friend. A faint smile crossed his face, though his eyes remained filled with quiet emotion. "After all these years," he answered honestly, "I still cannot explain that." 1 week later, the investigation had moved beyond questions of what had been found and toward the far more important task of returning names to people who had waited decades to hear them spoken again. The excavation continued with the same deliberate care, but the atmosphere around the shoreline had changed. The urgency of discovery had given way to quiet responsibility. Every item recovered was treated with patience, documented carefully, and handled with the understanding that it belonged to someone's family long before it belonged to any investigation. Transportation Safety Board specialists completed additional mapping of the buried wreckage, while geologists finalized their study of the shoreline itself. Their conclusion was remarkably simple. The aircraft had not disappeared because it landed in an impossible place. It had disappeared because the landscape had changed around it. Over more than 30 years, glacial runoff, seasonal flooding, winter ice, and thousands of tons of sediment had slowly transformed open water into solid ground. The newly formed sandbar where Rex first stopped had not existed when search crews originally combed the lake decades earlier. Nature had not hidden the answers forever. It had simply kept them until the land itself was ready to reveal them. Jack stood quietly beside Daniel as they looked across the shoreline. "If we had searched here back then," Jack said, "we would have been standing in several meters of water." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes an investigation is not solved because people become smarter," he replied. "Sometimes time finally changes the evidence." Those words stayed with Jack for the rest of the day. They eased a weight he had carried for more than 30 years. The search had not failed because his team had stopped trying. They had searched the landscape that existed then, not the one standing before them now. That afternoon, several families quietly arrived at the community hall after being contacted through the official investigation. There were no reporters waiting outside and no cameras following them through the door. Privacy had been carefully protected. Some families carried old photographs. Others brought newspaper clippings folded so many times that the edges had become soft with age. One elderly man unfolded a faded map marked with circles made by his father during the original search. Another woman held a birthday card that had never reached the relative who boarded the missing flight all those years ago. Daniel explained the progress of the investigation with calm honesty. He made no promises beyond what the evidence could support, but he assured every family that the recovery would continue with dignity and care. When the meeting ended, many people quietly stepped outside toward the lake. Rex had remained beside Jack throughout the afternoon, resting beneath the shade of a spruce tree. For the first time since the investigation began, he slowly rose on his own and walked toward the gathering families. He did not seek attention. He simply stopped beside a little girl, perhaps 8 years old, who stood holding her grandmother's hand. The child looked at the old German shepherd for a long moment before gently placing one small hand against his graying shoulder. "Is he the dog who found my great-grandfather?" she asked softly. No one answered immediately. Jack looked down at Rex, then at the child. "He helped us know where to keep looking," he said with a quiet smile. The little girl nodded, as though that answer was enough. She wrapped both arms around Rex's neck as carefully as if she understood he was very old. The shepherd closed his eyes for a brief moment and leaned gently into the embrace before slowly returning to Jack's side. As evening settled over the valley, the families left carrying something they had not possessed for decades. Not certainty about every unanswered question, but something just as valuable. Hope had finally replaced waiting. Back at the cabin that night, Jack filled Rex's food bowl as he always did. The old shepherd walked over, sniffed it once, then quietly turned away without eating. Jack knelt beside him and rested a hand against his shoulder. For the first time since they had met, he noticed that Rex's breathing seemed a little slower, a little heavier, as though the long journey they had unexpectedly shared that spring was finally asking to be paid for. 2 weeks later, the recovery operation officially came to an end. The shoreline slowly returned to silence as survey markers disappeared one by one and the last transport vehicles rolled back toward the highway. The investigators left behind no monuments, only careful records and the quiet satisfaction that every reasonable effort had been made. For the families, that was enough. The questions that could be answered had finally been answered. The ones that never could be were no longer carried alone. On a cool Saturday afternoon, a small memorial was held beside the lake. There were no television cameras, no reporters, and no speeches written for headlines. Only families, investigators, local volunteers, and a handful of retired Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers who remembered the original search more than 3 decades earlier. A simple wooden cross stood near the shoreline beside fresh cedar branches gathered from the surrounding forest. One by one, people stepped forward to place flowers overlooking the calm water. Some stood in silence. Others quietly shared stories with relatives who had spent most of their lives knowing only that someone they loved had disappeared into the northern wilderness. Jack remained near the back of the gathering, with Rex resting beside his boots. The old shepherd no longer tried to stand unless someone approached him first. Even then, he moved carefully, as though every step required quiet determination. Near the end of the memorial, the little girl Jack had met days earlier walked slowly toward him, carrying a folded sheet of paper. She held it out with both hands. "I made this for him," she said. Jack unfolded the drawing. It showed a German shepherd standing beside a blue lake beneath snow-covered mountains. Above the picture, written in careful handwriting, were 7 simple words. "Thank you for helping them find home." Jack swallowed quietly before folding the drawing and placing it inside his jacket. "He will keep this," he said softly. The little girl smiled and gently kissed Rex on the forehead before returning to her family. As the memorial ended, Daniel walked over carrying Jack's old notebook. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Jack opened it slowly to the final page. The familiar words were still there. Day 18. Search suspended due to deteriorating conditions. He stared at the sentence for a long moment before reaching into his jacket pocket for a pen. Without saying anything, he drew one careful line beneath the old entry. Then, on the next blank line, he wrote only 3 words. Search finally completed. He closed the notebook gently. For the first time in 34 years, it felt light in his hands. 3 days later, Rex remained asleep beside the fireplace long after sunrise. Jack brewed coffee, opened the curtains, and smiled toward the blanket in the corner. "Morning, partner," he said automatically. Rex opened his eyes and answered with the faintest movement of his tail. Jack sat beside him on the wooden floor and rested one hand against the old shepherd's shoulder. They remained together without speaking while soft morning light slowly filled the cabin. It was the kind of silence only lifelong partners understood. A little while later, Rex let out one slow breath and settled peacefully against Jack's arm. There was no struggle, no fear, only the quiet stillness of a faithful partner finally resting after completing the last assignment of his life. Several weeks afterward, Jack visited the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Dog Service Training Center carrying a small cedar box. Inside rested Rex's worn leather collar and service identification tag. Jack asked for only one thing. "Do not remember him because he found an aircraft," he told the young handlers gathered there. "Remember him because he never stopped looking for the people." The training supervisor accepted the collar with both hands. Months later, it was placed inside a modest display beside photographs of retired police dogs who had served communities across Canada. Beneath Rex's collar, a small brass plaque carried a single sentence chosen by Jack himself. "Some partners do not measure success by what they find. They measure it by who finally makes a home." The following spring, Jack returned alone to the same shoreline. The sandbar remained, shaped once again by another northern winter. Gentle waves rolled quietly onto the shore, while a lone loon called across the open water. Jack stood for several minutes before removing his cap and looking toward the place where Rex had first refused to take another step. A faint smile crossed his face. "Good work, partner," he whispered. Then he slipped the old notebook beneath his arm and walked back toward the truck, leaving only one set of footprints behind while the northern wind slowly erased the rest.